What if the most dangerous leaders in history weren't the obviously corrupt, power-hungry tyrants, but the ones who believed with unwavering conviction that they were saving the world? What if the true threat isn't deception, but self-deception at the highest level of power? This isn't fiction. It's how empires fall, how revolutions turn to terror, and how once brilliant minds become monuments to madness. Imagine a ruler who smiles as he destroys, convinced he's building paradise. He isn't lying to you, he's lying to himself. And because he believes it, so does everyone else. That's the terrifying truth Machiavelli uncovered 5 centuries ago, and it's more urgent today than ever before. From Roman emperors to modern tech billionaires, power doesn't just corrupt, it distorts reality. It rewires empathy, attracts enablers, silences truth, and rewards illusion. The higher someone rises, the fewer people can tell them they're wrong until they crash, dragging entire nations, companies, or civilizations down with them. This is the silent architecture of delusion that lives inside every throne, every boardroom, every leader. And the worst part? It doesn't take evil to get there, just success, isolation, and time. If we want to survive the age of curated power and digital manipulation, we must understand not just how leaders lie, but how they lose the ability to tell truth from fantasy. They're not lying to you. They're lying to themselves. The most terrifying leaders aren't the ones who knowingly commit evil. They are the ones who genuinely believe they're doing good. That's the paradox of power. It doesn't always begin with cruelty, but with conviction. A conviction so strong, so deeply rooted in the belief that they are saviors that they become blind to the wreckage they cause. This chapter begins with a question that should chill us all. What happens when someone gains the power to shape reality, but loses the ability to see it? Take Emperor Nero, Rome's golden boy. He began his reign with a promise cultured, poetic, beloved by the people. He lowered taxes, expanded rights, and positioned himself as a progressive ruler. And yet, within a decade, he had murdered his own mother, kicked his pregnant wife to death, and allegedly played the liar while half of Rome burned. But what makes Nero so chilling isn't just the violence, it's the delusion. Ancient accounts paint a picture of a man who truly believed he was divinely gifted. In his mind, his critics weren't opposing policy, they were attacking art, beauty, and divine purpose. His reign became a performance, and everyone who challenged the script was labeled a traitor. But this isn't ancient history, it's a pattern. We see it again in Howard Hughes, once a brilliant aviator and visionary entrepreneur. At his peak, he influenced American industry, media, and politics, but power unchecked transformed him. Paranoia replaced clarity. Isolation became doctrine. He locked himself away, consumed by imagined enemies, while his empire crumbled from within. Thousands lost jobs. Investors drowned in chaos. And it all stemmed not from malice, but from a single man's warped perception, elevated by influence and insulated from consequence. What these examples show us is that the most dangerous form of deception is not public, it's internal. These men weren't lying to the world. They had lied to themselves so effectively that reality itself became optional. And when a leader no longer feels the need to question their choices, when doubt is replaced with destiny, the world around them loses its anchor. It's here that Machiavelli's warnings come alive. Because once a leader begins to believe their own myth, they don't just stop listening to others. They begin rewriting the world to fit the story they've already told themselves. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. 5 centuries ago, Niccolo Machiavelli saw something that modern neuroscience is only beginning to confirm. Power doesn't just change what you do, it changes how you see. It isolates you from truth, mutates your sense of self, and seduces you into mistaking applause for wisdom. When Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1513, he wasn't writing a playbook for tyrants. He was dissecting a psychological transformation, how capable, intelligent leaders slowly become blind to the world they rule, even as they become more convinced than ever of their own brilliance. And that transformation begins with perception. Modern psychology now calls it social proof distortion. The idea that we judge ourselves by the reactions of others. And when you're in power, those reactions are curated. People see you on stages and headlines making confident decisions. They see the image, not the doubts. The result, you too start believing the version of yourself that others project. Doubt becomes unnecessary. Uncertainty becomes weakness. And slowly, your internal compass stops working not because you're dishonest, but because you're disconnected. This is where Machiavelli's insight becomes prophetic. He understood that power creates a mirror, not a window. The more powerful you become, the fewer people truly reflect reality back to you. Instead, you see only what you expect: loyalty, agreement, admiration. But this isn't validation, it's entrapment. And the longer you live inside that echo chamber, the more the real world becomes distorted background noise. What's even more disturbing is how this illusion feels completely rational from the inside. You're not trying to manipulate others. You believe you're being objective. You're just surrounded by experts who happen to agree with you, but those experts have incentives: access, approval, survival. They reinforce the illusion because your version of reality becomes their paycheck. Machiavelli warned that appearances could overpower truth, and he was right. Once a leader is surrounded only by affirmation, they begin to mistake performance for authenticity. And that's when the real danger begins. Because when a leader can no longer distinguish between applause and accuracy, they don't just fail quietly, they fail publicly, and they take others down with them. That's the cost of a world where perception is prized above reality, and Machiavelli saw it coming centuries before the rest of us. He who seeks to deceive will always find someone who lets himself be deceived. As a leader rises in power, the room doesn't just get quieter, it gets distorted. Opinions soften, truth becomes filtered, and a dangerous dynamic begins to form. People no longer tell you what's true, they tell you what they think you want to hear. But this isn't just about manipulation, it's about mutual survival. Advisors depend on your approval. Employees rely on your vision. Journalists seek your access. The result is an ecosystem where honesty becomes a risk and flattery becomes currency. Machiavelli warned us long ago, those in power don't need to chase illusions, illusions will come to them. And they will come dressed in respect, loyalty, admiration. That's the seduction. You believe people are being honest with you, but in reality, they're calibrating every word to maintain proximity to your influence. This isn't entirely malicious, it's strategic. But when everyone around you benefits from your version of reality, who will ever challenge it? This is how influence turns toxic. Because over time, a leader begins to believe that consensus equals truth. That if everyone agrees, it must be right. But they forget that the people agreeing have something to lose by disagreeing. And so the feedback loop tightens. Critics are dismissed. Doubt is discouraged. Disagreement feels like betrayal. Slowly, the leader becomes trapped in a world where reality is handcrafted to protect their ego. Modern psychology calls this motivated reasoning, at scale the process of shaping your environment to support your beliefs. But unlike ordinary people who must eventually face contradiction, powerful leaders can buy their own truth. They hire consultants who validate their instincts, fund research that confirms their positions, build media outlets that praise their decisions. It all feels logical because it's dressed in professionalism, data, and optimism, and that's the tragedy. The leader doesn't realize they're building a fortress of delusion. They think they're building clarity. They're not seeking falsehood, they're seeking comfort, and everyone around them is too invested to provide resistance. What begins as influence becomes insulation. What begins as leadership becomes isolation. And in that silence, a leader stops evolving. They become a myth in motion, powered not by wisdom but by echoes. Echoes that get louder even as truth fades into the distance. The act of wielding power physically reshapes the brain. We often think of power as a social force, external, structural, political. But what if the most dangerous effects of power aren't just about what it lets you do, but what it silently does to you? Modern neuroscience confirms something that Machiavelli could only sense centuries ago. Power doesn't just isolate the leader socially. It rewires their brain biologically. And the most chilling part, it makes empathy fade. According to neuroscientist Sukhvinder Obi, brain scans show that people in positions of authority experience reduced activity in the regions responsible for empathy and social cognition. In simpler terms, the longer someone wields power, the harder it becomes for them to understand how others think, feel, or perceive their actions. Not because they're evil, but because they've become neurologically detached. This isn't corruption by choice. It's a slow, invisible drift, a hardening of the mind masked as confidence. Think about the implications. Leaders begin to act not based on shared human experience, but on abstract projections, metrics, strategy, vision. They lose access to the emotional nuance of consequence. When they make decisions, it no longer feels like it affects real people. It becomes a chess move, a necessary sacrifice, an acceptable loss. The moral weight of power fades not because it is rejected, but because it is no longer felt. Nowhere is this more evident than in the collapse of once revered leaders. Take the executives of Enron. For years, they were celebrated as financial innovators, visionaries reshaping the future. But inside that insulated tower of praise, they came to believe their fraudulent practices weren't wrong. They were genius. Reality was rewritten. Critics were dismissed, and by the time collapse came, they weren't just fooling the public, they had fooled themselves. That's the true danger, when delusion becomes so embedded that even the guilty see themselves as righteous. Not because they're trying to manipulate, but because their minds can no longer receive contradiction. And the world around them, full of yes men, filtered data, and curated praise, keeps feeding the illusion. Machiavelli didn't need a brain scan to recognize this. He saw that when a ruler no longer understands how others perceive their actions, they become something less than human and more than dangerous. They become untouchable, unreadable, and uncorrectable. A mind unmoored from empathy is a throne without balance, destined not just to rule, but to ruin. To estimate the intelligence of a ruler, look at the people around him. Machiavelli. There's a reason Machiavelli didn't tell us to judge a ruler by their speeches, their image, or their popularity, but by their advisors, because nothing reveals the state of a leader's mind more clearly than the people they choose to keep close. Who do they listen to? Who dares to disagree? Who survives when they say the uncomfortable truth? These answers reveal more than policy ever could. They expose whether a leader is still grounded in reality or drifting into the fog of self-worship. The tragedy is that most delusional leaders don't start out this way. They begin as sharp thinkers who do surround themselves with talent, challenge, and rigor. But over time, as pressure mounts and success inflates identity, a subtle shift occurs. Doubt starts to feel like disloyalty. Criticism feels like disrespect. And slowly the leader begins replacing truth-tellers with cheerleaders. Not out of malice, but out of emotional exhaustion. They no longer seek clarity, they seek comfort. This is the rise of the advisor trap, where your inner circle becomes less about excellence and more about reflection. You stop hiring people who are brilliant in their own right, and start selecting those who reflect your supposed brilliance back to you. And with each new echo added, the walls thicken. The room gets warmer, and reality starts to bend in your favor. Psychologists describe this as groupthink acceleration, where teams don't just agree with the leader, they compete to validate the leader's vision to more extreme degrees. Independent thought becomes a liability. Original ideas get filtered through the lens of will he like this. The most terrifying example, Emperor Caligula. He didn't just silence dissent. He declared himself a god, made his horse a consul, and watched as senators played along just to survive. What seems absurd now was deadly serious then. And the more absurd it got, the more loyalty was required. But this pattern is everywhere. In corporations, in politics, even in relationships. The moment your ego becomes more important than the truth, you start rewarding those who protect your pride, not those who protect your clarity. And once that shift happens, you're no longer leading, you're being performed for. Surrounded by masks, mirrors, and silence, a ruler no longer hears the world. They hear only themselves, echoed back louder and louder until that echo becomes their only reality. It is much safer to be feared than loved, because love is preserved by a bond of obligation easily broken. Machiavelli. When Machiavelli warned that it's safer to be feared than loved, He wasn't promoting cruelty, he was diagnosing a psychological vulnerability that still destroys leaders today, the need to be liked while holding power. On the surface, this desire seems noble. Who doesn't want to be admired for doing good? But in leadership, that desire quickly mutates into a trap. Because the more a leader identifies with being virtuous, the more they become incapable of recognizing when they're no longer acting that way. This is what psychologists call moral licensing. When someone does something they perceive as good, they subconsciously give themselves permission to bend the rules afterward. For leaders, this distortion scales dangerously. Every public victory, every speech about justice, every policy that helps the people becomes a psychological shield, protecting them not from criticism, but from guilt. And once that shield is in place, even the most unethical acts can be reframed as service. It begins subtly. A difficult decision is avoided not because it's wrong, but because it might damage their image. A critic is silenced not because they're dangerous, but because they're negative. Then comes the story, rewriting. I'm not acting out of self-interest, this is sacrifice. I'm not avoiding hard truths, I'm preserving hope. Before long, they believe these narratives completely. And anyone who questions them isn't just disagreeing, they're seen as morally corrupt. Because to challenge the hero is to become the villain. Take the case of Lance Armstrong. His public identity survivor champion inspiration was so tightly bound to moral strength that when doping accusations arose, he didn't just deny them. He destroyed those who told the truth. He wasn't protecting a title, he believed he was protecting hope for cancer patients worldwide. In his mind, virtue justified the violence. And that's how the moral illusion trap consumes even the well-intentioned. Over time, leaders don't just seek to do good, they seek to appear good. And in defending that appearance, they often commit the very wrongs they once stood against. Machiavelli saw it centuries ago, love based on obligation fades. And when virtue becomes a mask rather than a compass, the mask always wins until it breaks. And when it does, what's left behind is not a savior, but a stranger to the very values they once claimed to serve. Fortune is the arbiter of half of our actions. But we direct the other half ourselves. Machiavelli. Every successful leader at some point begins to feel untouchable. Their decisions work. Their instincts seem prophetic. People listen. Results appear. The world seems to bend to their will. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they stop accounting for luck. They stop planning for failure. They start to believe that they can control outcomes by force of will alone. This is not ambition. It's the illusion of control. And it is one of the most dangerous psychological traps in leadership. Machiavelli warned that fortune plays a role in every achievement, but modern leaders often forget this truth. They mistake a lucky market, a perfectly timed launch, or a competitor's collapse as evidence of their own brilliance. And because they've been rewarded for risk, they begin to escalate commitment, doubling down on reckless decisions, convinced that their judgment is not just good, but infallible. This is how prudence begins to look like weakness. Taking precautions becomes fear. Listening to experts becomes doubt. Accepting limitations feels like betrayal to their image of genius. Leaders surrounded by praise interpret skepticism as small-mindedness, and when strategies fail, they blame everyone except themselves, the market, the regulators, the disloyal staff, the media, anything but their own blindness. We've seen this play out in real time. Elon Musk hailed as a visionary for his success with PayPal, Tesla, and SpaceX began pushing timelines that engineers found unrealistic, ignoring critical warnings, dismissing seasoned professionals as lacking vision. His aura of confidence was so magnetic that even when challenges arose, investors and fans sided with his optimism over technical reality. For a time it worked until the cracks could no longer be painted over. This is the spiral success feeds overconfidence. Overconfidence invites risk. Risk brings collapse. And when it comes, it shocks no one but the leader. Because to them, failure wasn't part of the equation. They believed they had outgrown it. But Machiavelli reminds us, no one escapes fortune. The leader who forgets this will one day bet the empire on a feeling and lose it all. Not because they lacked brilliance, but because they mistook their brilliance for control. And when a leader thinks they're above chance, they stop preparing for impact. And those around them are left to feel the fall. Men should be either treated generously or destroyed because they take revenge for slight injuries for heavy ones they cannot. Machiavelli. There comes a moment in the life of every delusional leader when criticism no longer feels like disagreement, it feels like an attack. Questions become sabotage. Skepticism becomes treason. And from that moment on, their perception of reality is no longer governed by truth but by fear. Not fear of failure, but fear of betrayal. That's when the spiral begins, the slow, suffocating descent into paranoia, where every voice is a potential enemy and every silence a hidden conspiracy. Psychologists call this hostile attribution bias, the tendency to interpret ambiguous behavior as threatening. In ordinary people, it breeds insecurity. In powerful leaders, it becomes a weapon. Because when you've surrounded yourself with praise and removed dissent, anyone who still dares to speak up must have a hidden agenda, right? The mind, now addicted to loyalty and affirmation, rejects contradiction not just as wrong, but as dangerous. The result is a feedback loop of suspicion and control. And tragically, this suspicion often becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more paranoid a leader becomes, the more forcefully they suppress independence. But suppression breeds resentment. Silenced voices begin to whisper. Resistance becomes real, not because it started that way, but because repression created it. The leader then tightens their grip further, seeing this resistance as confirmation of the threat. And so the cycle continues. Paranoia creates enemies, which justifies more paranoia. History gives us chilling examples. Joseph Stalin, once a revolutionary idealist, gradually descended into absolute distrust. He began purging allies, seeing betrayal in every corner. Critics weren't just wrong, they were threats to the revolution itself. In defending his ideals, he destroyed them. What began as vigilance became violence, and what was once ideological conviction mutated into terror, fueled by ghosts of imagined conspiracies. This is the cost of unchecked isolation. A leader no longer sees the world as it is, but as a battlefield where every shadow could be an assassin. They aren't monsters from the start. They're human beings who step by step cut themselves off from truth, empathy, and contradiction. And the more isolated they become, the more fragile their ego grows, despite outward power. The most dangerous ruler isn't the one who is hated, it's the one who cannot bear the idea that anyone might see them as wrong. Because when fear replaces reflection, the crown becomes a cage, and the ruler becomes its prisoner. Men in general judge more by the sense of sight than by the sense of touch, because everyone can see, but few can feel. Machiavelli. In Machiavelli's time, the illusion of power was crafted through theater ceremony and carefully curated appearances. But in our age, that illusion has evolved into something far more potent, programmable, scalable, and digitally reinforced. The delusion of modern leaders isn't built by accident, it's engineered by design. Today, power doesn't just distort perception, it builds its own universe filled with agreeable data, curated praise, and self-reinforcing narratives, all protected by walls of algorithms. A modern leader doesn't just receive filtered feedback, they fund it. They sponsor research institutes that publish studies in their favor. They buy media platforms that frame every misstep as misunderstood genius. They hire armies of consultants to polish decisions of PR firms, to soften mistakes of influencers, to reframe failure as disruption. And through this vast architecture of information control, truth becomes irrelevant because perception becomes everything. This is the new delusion leaders who are simultaneously more informed and more disconnected from reality than at any point in history. They have access to infinite data, but only the kind they're willing to see. They receive endless praise, but only from those who are paid to deliver it. And worst of all, they begin to believe that this curated world is the real one, not out of vanity, but out of exposure. When every article affirms your brilliance and every feed reflects your worldview, how could you not believe it? Social media only amplifies this divide. Platforms are designed to feed you what keeps you engaged, not what keeps you grounded. And if you're powerful enough, you can fine-tune this engagement until it becomes an echo chamber of epic proportions. You see yourself not as fallible, but as visionary, not as controversial, but as courageous, and any contradiction becomes negativity, jealousy, or resistance to progress. This isn't a flaw in the system, it is the system. A feedback loop where those with power have the resources to protect their egos from reality itself. Machiavelli warned that few people can feel what is true, and today's leaders rarely even touch it. Surrounded by digital mirrors and digital followers, they drift into delusion, not as a collapse, but as a calculated ascent. And by the time truth knocks, they've built a kingdom that no longer has a door. The price of leadership, like the price of freedom, is eternal vigilance. If power predictably distorts perception, then the answer cannot rest in personal virtue alone. History has proven that even the most intelligent, ethical, and visionary individuals are vulnerable to the psychological traps that Machiavelli warned us about: isolation, flattery, moral self-delusion, and the engineered comfort of curated truth. The solution, then, is not to demand superhuman leaders, but to design superhuman systems, institutions that keep power connected to reality even when the person in charge no longer can. Great leadership isn't about being immune to illusion. It's about being surrounded by mechanisms that make illusion impossible to sustain. Abraham Lincoln understood this. His team of rivals wasn't just political theater, it was a structural commitment to discomfort. He surrounded himself with opponents who challenged him, disagreed with him, and held independent power. Why? Because he knew that unchecked agreement kills clarity. Franklin D. Roosevelt followed a similar path, creating a competitive chaos among advisors to ensure multiple perspectives would always collide before reaching his desk. In the modern era, Ray Dalio's Bridgewater adopted radical transparency where anyone regardless of rank can challenge leadership openly. It's not about disrespect, it's about protecting clarity. These examples show us that the most successful leaders institutionalize dissent before they lose the ability to tolerate it. They don't rely on willpower to stay grounded, they build systems that force them to. This approach must go beyond individuals. Organizations, governments, even families need structural safeguards, anonymous feedback loops, rotating advisors, red team exercises that stress test decisions, reward structures that elevate truth over flattery, because the psychological weight of power will always pull leaders toward delusion, and without resistance, they will fall. And yet these systems only work if they're vigilantly maintained. The moment honesty is punished or sycophancy is rewarded, the structure begins to collapse, slowly, quietly, until another leader finds themselves staring into a mirror that only flatters while the ground beneath them rots. In the end, Machiavelli's great insight wasn't just about how leaders lose control, but how entire societies allow them to. Responsibility doesn't lie with rulers alone. It lies with those who build, protect, and enforce the boundaries around them. We cannot stop the human mind from drifting, but we can build institutions strong enough to pull it back. And that may be the only thing standing between power and ruin. The most dangerous form of delusion isn't believing a lie, it's building your entire identity around a truth that was never tested. This is the silent lesson behind every fallen leader, broken organization, or failed relationship. The higher you rise without contradiction, the more fragile your mind becomes. Power, whether in a corporate office, a social circle, or your personal life, has a way of insulating you from discomfort. And that's exactly where self-deception begins. So how do we protect ourselves? By actively seeking what powerful people often lose: honest feedback. Make space for people who challenge you. Learn to pause before dismissing disagreement. Understand that criticism, when given with clarity, is not an attack, it's a gift. It's a signal that you're still reachable, that your ego hasn't sealed the doors yet. And don't just apply this to others, apply it to yourself. Be wary of the curated world you live in, the algorithms that only show what you already believe, the friends who only echo your opinions, the stories you tell yourself about who you are. Because unchecked comfort is where growth dies and where illusion thrives. True strength isn't about being above others, it's about being open to truth even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. If this message made you reflect even for a second, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this video. We live in a world that desperately needs leaders, creators, and everyday people who are strong enough to stay humble and wise enough to remain grounded. Let's keep learning. Let's keep questioning. And most importantly, let's stay real.